Since Susanna just did such a great job of discussing the equity issues, I'll just, my principal obligation is to get out of the way so we can talk to the other researchers. Let me just make a few observations. First, looking at the slide in front of you, I've tried to capture a sense of what's been happening to disparities over time, comparing the California experience over these last 10 years with that of other states and with the nation on the whole, using average scores on NAEP, looking at 8th grade reading. Now, I want to underscore the fact that every state has its own achievement measures and its own testing regime. NAEP is the one that applies everywhere, as you know, and often referred to as the gold standard, but it's the gold standard only with respect to what it measures and the constructs. But that said, I still think it's an important indicator. I know that it is a very important indicator, partial indicator of where we are with respect to achievement and hence where we are with respect to disparities in achievement. Looking across the first row in this matrix, I've asked the question, if we simply look at performance for all students in California versus all students nationally, and compare the average scores, the average scale scores in NAEP. In 2007, there were only 3 states that were performing worse than California relative to the national average. So another way of saying that would be in terms of the average reading score in 8th grade, California was 4th from the bottom. 10 years later, we're 15th from the bottom. So that could be thought of as progress relative to the worst performing schools. But since we know that the average NAEP performance is still not great relative to the needs of the economy and relative to other countries, saying that we're 15th from the bottom is not, in my opinion, evidence that California is on the so-called right path. Certainly, if it is, it's not running. The second line focuses not on all students, but specifically on how are we doing with respect to the Hispanic-white disparity in achievement. Again, the first column compares the disparity in California with what's going on nationally. And in 2007, it shows that our disparity was worse than the disparities in every other state except for these 8. 2017, our situation, our relative situation had deteriorated to the fact that we were worse than every other state in the country in the magnitude of our disparity, except for these 4. And you can interpret the bottom row for yourselves. The bottom line, as Susanna observed, is that we're definitely not where we want to be. And to the extent one can see some inklings of some improvements by some measures, it is by no means, in my view, it is not encouraging, and we have to look for what else must be done to accelerate closing of these gaps. If I can look at the next slide, please. All right, this is just another portrayal of the same thing, and you'll all have access to the slides. But I think on the right, you see quite clearly that a little bit of progress in California relative to national average, but the disparities, which is what's graphed up above, the disparities have changed only a little. And what we certainly would hope to see over a decade of experience is much more convergence of these lines and a downward trend. Next slide, please. I think most of you have probably heard me raise concerns before about the erosion of both national and state level accountability for outcomes as well as for resources and opportunities. In particular, from an equity standpoint, the question is, who will be accountable for narrowing the disparities that we observe, both in inputs and outputs? The weakening of the federal system was replaced by an expectation that states and districts would step into the breach. As you know, in California, instead of stepping into the breach, there's been a devolution of authority through the LCAP process. So there is an increase in resources, LCFF, but in a context in which resources in general are still quite low relative to what's going on in other states and relative to the needs in California, as is pointed out in the research papers of Getting Down to Facts. So more resources resources distributed more equitably at the local level, but still not enough, which raises the question of whether the LCAP process is replacing the accountability structure in an effective way. The hypothesis was, of course, that this kind of public engagement would change the local politics of education equity. But the research reported in the studies, the Getting Down to Facts research, suggests that the LCAP process simply isn't yet living up to the hopes for broad and effective engagement of community voices in ways that would be informed, in ways that would create the necessary external pressures to make equity a priority in the decision-making at the district and county level. That is something that I think we all have to watch very carefully. So it's A, don't be fooled by the fact that too little money is now being distributed more equitably. And second, don't be fooled by the fact that public participation is invited through the LCAP process when the initial evidence is that that process is not effective at making equity a high priority at the district's level. So what to do? Well, there's some suggestions in the papers, but I want to point in particular to one, and that is, as we try to do better with the tools we have before us, we also have to look at the definition of education equity. I believe that the recent science developments with respect to children and youth development, brain science, adversity science, reinforces now with biological models the importance of context, the context of adversity, of chronic stress, incidents of racism, incidents of high poverty, especially concentrated poverty, and the way in which those circumstances affect brain structure and brain function that have a direct impact on learning. It tells us that the wraparound services we all have been advocating for many years is not just being nice. It's not just some kind of remedial measure for folks who have had a hard time. It's absolutely essential if we want to level the playing field. And I would say essentially in a way that points to obligations not only of school districts, but from all the other child-serving bureaucracies and community organizations that can provide the interventions and the supports that children need in order to mitigate the effects of poverty, of adversity, of chronic stress. Equity requires, in other words, a response to the needs created by context. And equity requires that resources in the school, but also outside the school, be brought to bear on the challenge of giving students what they need in order to have a reasonable shot at success. So I want to broaden that to another equity move in addition to resources, in addition to quality teachers, in addition to protecting investments in kids from the pension squeeze and so forth. And finally, I just want to plant the seed of an idea that I don't think we can wait 10 years for another empirical examination of the state of equity in California. I think that we need in 3 years, if you will, getting down to facts 2.3, focused on equity issues, again rallying researchers with input from the advocacy community, from stakeholders into what the important research questions are, to do a deep dive and look at some of these equity issues in more detail in order to inform public policies that will respond to the needs that to the needs that the kids have that as yet are not being addressed.